put this in perspective. You're the new organist. You have no idea what you're doing. You've played the piano, you've learned a few tunes, and now you're confronted with this. It looks like the space shuttle. You're terrified. No need. Let's go through it one step at a time and show you how to do the things that you need to do to make this sound good. Let's start with turning the thing on. Where do they hide the switch? It turns out that's sometimes the hardest part of playing one, is finding out how to turn it on. The switches are usually right here to the left of the keys, right here to the right of the keys, or underneath one of these side things. Virtually every organ I've ever played will have it one place or another. So turn it on. You can hear it warm up a little bit. In pipe organs, it's wind getting in the pipes. In electronics, it's all the electronics warming up. Now let's look what we've got. Black keys and white keys. This looks familiar because you play piano. These do the same things as the keys on the piano. You push it down, you get some music. There's just 2 rows of them, and there's this stuff down here. It's a whole set of pedal keys that are also black and white. You got to play these with your feet. Not so bad. We'll get there. Notice too, you've got a whole bunch of little rocker switches. You've got a whole bunch of buttons. What do you do with them all? Let's go through them one at a time. Let's start out. How do you sit at the organ? What happens? How far away do you sit? You sit up here. You sit back there. Here's the general rule. You sit down and you arrange the bench so that when about half of your thigh is on the bench, the front of your toes just about hits the black keys. Just in height and in distance away. That's just perfect. What happens if you're a little tiny person and your legs aren't long enough? Well, sometimes you can adjust the bench height. If that's not enough, then you slide forward and let your legs droop a little bit. It always works. No problem. Okay. Notice that there are 3 groups of these little switches. One called pedal. Guess what? These things make different sounds happen on the pedals. How about swell and grate? Well, the grate stands for great organ. That's where you'll do most of your playing, especially for hymns. And by convention, in LDS chapels at least, it's always the bottom manual. So all of these things will make sounds appear when you play on the grate manual. The swell is this upper one. It comes from an old term used in the Middle Ages. In those days, they had a bunch of the pipes in a box up in the organ loft. And the box had little louvers on it. And when you pushed a pedal, the louvers would open and let the sound out. That was called the swell box, because the sound would swell when you pushed the pedal to make the sound out. So this is called the swell organ. Now, so we have the swell, the grate, and this is called the pedal clavier. Now, what do you do? Oh, and all these buttons? We'll talk about that in a minute. While we're talking about sitting at the organ, let's talk about a few other things. First of all, where do you sit side to side? Well, the best place is right smack in the middle. Okay, what's the middle? Well, on a piano, you know where to find middle C. On an organ, it's not nearly as obvious. So what you do is start at both ends like this and go from C to C to C, and the one your left thumb ends up on is middle C. So you sit right in front of that middle C and you'll be right in the right place. Now let's talk about what all these things do. There are 4 different kinds of organ stops. Each one of these things is an organ stop. And you'll see these keys all have, these little switches all have names on. This one, for example, says diapason 8. What's a diapason and what does the 8 mean? It turns out that there are 4 basic families of organ stops. The diapason is your general organ stop. So here's what a diapason sounds like, and this is just a C chord. That's your general organ stop. If you play a lot of diapasons, you can get a pretty nice big chord. So there's your big organ chord. The next general family is the flutes. And a flute sounds like, guess what? A flute. The next one is the strings. And strings sound like, how about that? Strings. The fourth general selection is called reeds, again for obvious reasons. And what you have to do when you, what's called setting the stops or picking a registration, is find groups of these stops that sound good together. How do you know whether you have a diapason, a flute, a string, or a reed? Well, it turns out that these might be written in English, French, German, Spanish, lots of different languages, Dutch sometimes. There are some easy clues. Anything that says diapason or principal is going to be your standard organ stop. So here's a diapason that plays on the great manual. You can see I pulled it from the stops that say great. Here's a diapason, plays on the swell. It's a little softer, a little different in sound, but still the same general main organ stop. Flutes will be called flute. Here's or borden. Bordens are made, the pipes are actually made of boards, but they sound like flutes. So this is a flute stop, or a harmonic flute here. Still flute, slightly different. Okay, what do you do with 8, 4, 2 and all that stuff? It turns out, you remember when you have a rubber band and you pluck a rubber band, the shorter the rubber band, the higher the sound is. That works with organs too. The shorter the pipe, the higher the sound. So originally, an 8-foot pipe, that's what the 8 means, is the pipe is 8 feet long. The 8-foot pipe was the lowest note on one of the manuals. So that pipe is 8 feet long. Suppose you cut it in half, what happens? Then you have a 4-foot pipe. That sounds like that. Cut it in half again and you have a 2-foot pipe. Put them all together and you have a bigger sound. So the 8, 4, 2 and all that stuff just tells you how high the note will sound when you push the key down. You can use that to help you do things when you're playing the organ. So let us start out with just setting some general stops that you'll find useful in playing easy hymns. For a general congregation, you want an 8-foot diapason or principal. You want a 4-foot diapason, it's called diapason principal, maybe octave. You want a 2-foot stop that might be called a 15th, a principal, a super octave. So we'll set those 3. And here's what we get. In the pedals, you'll want something that's called octave or principal, and we'll set 8-foot or 16 in the pedal, and here's what you've got. Now let's add the chords in. Presto, you have a hymn that people will sing to, and it sounds really, really good. Incidentally, I owe you an apology. I pulled a fast one on you because I started playing the pedals. So let's look at the pedal clavier for a minute. It has black keys and white ones, just like the swell and the great. The middle of the pedal clavier is right close to where you're sitting, so that's the middle, basically middle C on the pedal clavier. So when you sit down at the organ so you're conveniently located for that. Put your left toe right on the F down here, and you can play the G with your left heel. So you have all those 3 notes and you won't even need to look. That helps. How do you keep from hitting 2 notes at the same time? Well, that's easy. The best way to do it is to wear shoes that are kind of narrow in the toe. Don't wear your swim flippers or something really big on the toe, because you'll do this instead. And we don't want to do that. It's recommended not to take your shoes off. Little old ladies take their shoes off and point with their little pinkies and toes and stuff. We don't need to do that. It's not good practice. There is a way you can cheat. I almost hate to tell you. But on some organs, way over here on the side, you will have a key that says bass or instant pedal, or it says a number of different things. Fiddle around until you find it. And what that does, here's the way it is without that note. With it, I just turned it on. Listen to what happens. The sound is fuller because it automatically adds in that note. So let's play this Sweet Hour of Prayer with the pedals, but without the cheat. It sounds like this. Notice I'm not even looking at the pedals. You don't need to. Now let's put the bass in, and I will not play the pedal at all. Okay, let's talk about one other little problem. How do you make the organ louder or softer? In the old days, you only had one choice. You would start with some note, and then you would add more stops until you finally got as loud as you wanted. We cheat. With electronics, you can cheat. If you look down here, just above the pedal clavier, there are a couple little flat pedals right here. The one on the left is usually called the expression pedal or the volume pedal. And what happens is when you push that one down, it gets louder and louder, or softer as the case may be. What's the one on the right? Well, the one on the right on most organs is what's called the crescendo pedal. And it does exactly what we would have done 200 years ago. It adds stops. The more you push it down, the more stops you get. So let's start out with something really quiet and push it down. And it should be adding more stops. If I did this right, I didn't do it right. Let's try one more thing. Here we go. Now I'll do it right. So you start out with this, and you end up with this. So those are the two cheating ways to make things softer or louder. What you want to do is start somewhere in the middle. So for a congregational hymn, you might want to start like here. And if your congregation is drowning you out, boost it a little bit. Okay, now let's talk about all these stupid little buttons. What do all those little buttons do? They give you a whole list of stops that are already set, of combinations. Most organs will have several different sets of these. It says there are 10 here. Most organs will actually have 40. In fact, this organ has 40. There are little keys here that say M. Those are manifolds. Those are manifolds of stops. Manifold 1 is virtually always factory set. So you find whatever the default is, it'll be M1 or number 1 on a little dial over on the side. If you push number 1, it will give you a very soft stop that you can use for prelude music. Number 2 will be slightly louder. And so on till you get to number 10, which will be full organ. So the easy way to learn how to set stops is to push some number between 1 and 10. Usually on these, 1 through about 4 are perfect for prelude music. You want to use something like 5 for a sacrament hymn. Let's see, good sacrament hymn. For an opening or closing hymn, you might use somewhere 6 to 8, depending on how vigorous the hymn is. Let me find one here that's a good sacrament, good opening hymn. Okay. You know what? That's not vigorous enough. Let's go to the next one up. That'll work fine. So that's the easy way to set stops and get registration. By the way, you'll notice that I souped up that last one just a little bit by not doing anything particularly fancy. I just repeated the chords that were already there. Let's take a look at this right at the chorus. Exactly the chords that were already written. Instead of just playing them and holding them, I played them a couple times. That reinforces the rhythm, and on a really rhythmic hymn like Come O Thou King of Kings, you may want to do that. Remember, the music is not a straitjacket. It gives you the opportunity to play what's best for the spirit of the meeting, for the congregation you're working with, and you can do as much as your own skill level and confidence will allow you to do, as long as it fits within the spirit you want of the meeting. Let's talk a little bit about setting stops and all of these little buttons. The first button you need to know about is the one that's usually at the very far right, at the very bottom button right there. This one has a 0 on it. That's called the general cancel. Always hit this at the end of a hymn. That way you won't end up accidentally hitting the pedal during the sacrament prayer or something. So press that 0, it completely blanks out the whole organ. Very important button to know. Now let's talk about setting stops, doing registration. Let's say you want to do an opening hymn. We'll start with a diapason 8-foot. That's the basic organ stop. We'll then put in a diapason 4-foot. On this organ it's called an octave. A diapason 2-foot, it's called the 15th on this organ. We'll then put in the 8-foot diapason, which is called octave on this organ, and probably a fairly soft 16-foot. You have to fiddle around to see exactly what goes with what. But this one works well for a general congregational hymn. You can see you don't have to put down lots of stops. And that'll work fine. Suppose that's not loud enough. What do you do? Well, then you can start adding some other stops. To your 8-foot diapason, let's add an 8-foot flute. And let's add a 4-foot flute. Now let's see what we've got. It's a lot better, a little brighter because of the extra 4-foot in it, and congregations will sing. Now, suppose you really, really like this combination of stops and you want to save it so you don't have to do it from scratch every time you sit down at the organ. How do you do that? Well, that's where all these little buttons come in. These are called presets. You remember I told you there are some factory presets. They're usually on the first manifold of stops. So let's change some of the factory presets. Let's go to the, say, the 4th manifold. Now, to set a stop, you'll find a little button over here that says Set. So you push in Set, you set your stops however you like them, you push in Set, and then you push in one of these numbers. I'll push in 7. Okay? Now, notice the light goes on. That means that stop number 7, preset number 7 is set with exactly these stops. So now I'm going to turn everything off with the general cancel. So on manifold 4, I'll push number 7, and bing, it all comes back. That's how you use the presets. If you want to change between verses, let's say that in the first verse you want to start out a little bit softer without some of the extra stops. So let's set that as number 6. Then you can start playing with number 6. And if you want to go louder all of a sudden, push number 7. You've got the extra ones in. Works beautifully. It's nice not to play the same thing all the time. Incidentally, this organ, and some you'll see, have a whole bunch of little chrome-plated buttons down there at the bottom. What those are is they do exactly the same things as these 10 stops. So you can see you just push one of those with your feet. Sometimes your hands are busy, and you may want to change between 6 and 7 just by pushing it with your foot. It does exactly the same thing as pushing these with your finger. Very handy thing to have. What are all these buttons? Well, it turns out these 5 presets affect only the swell. These 5 affect only the grate. These 5 affect only the pedal. Complicated? Yeah. Do you need to use them all the time? No, but it's nice to know they're there when you want them. Okay, now you aren't always playing hymns, be they sacrament hymns or congregational hymns, opening, closing. You want to play something nice for prelude. So what do you do with the stops for prelude music? This is where the swell manual comes in, because many of the stops on the swell are designed to come out really nicely as solo stops. So for this one, let's find something that we can use as an accompaniment on the grate. We'll play the melody on the swell. So on the grate, we have a stop called a flute celeste. Now let me say something about celeste stops. They're kind of special because celestes are deliberately made out of tune. And when you have a celeste stop, what you have is 2 pipes or 2 notes that are very slightly out of tune, so you get a little bit of interference. What's the difference? Well, here is a flute. And here is a flute celeste with the celeste. And here it's a little bit sweeter sound. And this is the kind of thing you want for prelude music. So let's use this as the background. We'll set in the pedal a very soft 16 foot. And then for the swell, let's set a flute at 8 foot and 2 foot and turn on the tremolo and listen to what you get. Sounds pretty good, doesn't it? Let's see what else we can do. Well, this organ has an oboe stop. That's a nice solo stop. Pretty good. Let's try one more. Let's try a principal and play that down an octave. You don't have to play the same thing all the time. There are 3 really easy ones that you just learned. A principal down an octave, a reed stop, like an oboe is a soft reed, or flute 8 and 2 with tremolo. While we're at it, let's talk tremolo for a little bit. You can see what a tremolo does. Let's start out with a flute stop without tremolo. Turn on the tremolo. You see it goes wah, 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 wah. That's wonderful and beautiful for prelude music, but when you use that on hymns, it throws the congregation off because they don't know where the pitch is. The tremolo makes the pitch wobble. So here's a rule. Never, ever use tremolo for congregational singing. It just doesn't work. You're fighting yourself when you do that. On the other hand, tremolos and celestes are wonderful for prelude and postlude. And by the way, since both tremolo and celeste make the pitch waver, it's good practice not to use them both at the same time for the same melody. You can see here's just the 8-foot flute. We can make it come out a little more by adding the 2-foot. If you really want to be adventurous, you can switch manuals and play the accompaniment on the swell and the solo on the grate. Same kinds of solo stops. Notice a break. That brings up a real question. When do you make the melody super smooth, what musicians call legato, or when do you put breaks in? Well, you want to put breaks in when it's necessary, when you have repeated notes, or when you have a phrase where you would breathe if you were singing it. Imagine what would happen if you played God Be With You Till We Meet Again like this. How do people know where to sing? Well, they don't. So what you have to do is put a break in between all the notes that are repeated. Officially, when you repeat a note, you give the first note only half its written value and then put a rest in for the rest. Doesn't matter. Just make sure there's a nice space in between and do it deliberately. If you're on the piano, you'd play it like this. That's kind of choppy for the organ. So let's do it just putting some space in between like this. That way you can tell the difference between the notes and people will catch that and they'll sing right along. Same thing when you're playing a hymn where there's a break for breath or a break in the phrasing. Come unto Jesus, break. Ye heavy laden. That was a big break here because you're breaking and singing. It's not hard, it just makes sense. So do it the way that you would like to hear it if you were singing. It's simple. Okay, one little problem we haven't talked about yet. Your hand is only capable of playing one of 5 notes at any given time. Sometimes the hymn goes further than that. So what do? Well, you cheat. And here's how you do it. Let's take "The Lord my pasture will prepare," because the melody goes a little all over. So we'll start like this. Whoops, run out of fingers. So what do? Well, you just leave that note down and switch it to another finger. That way you can stretch up to this high note and you don't run out of fingers. Now what we're going to do is I'm going to switch, instead of using the 4th finger here, I'm going to use the 5th finger there. You notice what you can do on the organ that you can't do on the piano is you can take one note down and you can put as many fingers as you want on that note and the note will stay the same. That's something you just get used to doing. It's not natural. Therefore, practice a little bit. It works beautifully. You'll get used to it. After a while you get to so you don't even think about it. I've played for long enough, I don't think about it anymore, and I should. So this is what you do. You just change it as you need. Notice you land the 2nd finger, I'm going to switch to the 3rd. It's something you'll get used to, and it's not hard. This is not rocket science. You'll catch on really easily. It just takes a little practice. Okay, now let's talk about one more little cheat that will help you a lot. Notice that in 6 hymns in 6 days, the hymns are all in the key of C, that is no sharps or flats, or in the key of G with just 1 sharp. But you probably want to play the hymns in the same key that they're written in the hymn book, because that's the way people are used to singing them. How do you do that? Well, if you happen to have a degree in music, you just sit down and play it and transpose it in your head. Most people don't have degrees in music, so they have to find some other way to do it. It turns out the organ manufacturers are very helpful. They put in most of the organs in the church a way to transpose, that is to play like a C on this organ and have it sound like a D when it comes out. So you play the keys you're used to and it comes out sounding different. That's called transposing. On this organ, there's a knob over here on this end of the keyboard. And if you turn it, notice the note isn't changing that I'm pushing down, but the one you hear is somewhat different. So let's say you're doing Onward Christian Soldiers, that's hymn 246. The first note in here is a G, the first note in the hymn book is an A. How do you get from the G in here to the A in the hymn book? If you look on the keyboard, G to an A is 1 step, 2 steps. So you go 2 notes up, you just transpose this up 2 notes. Now when you play this, it's in exactly the key that it's written in in the hymn book, and people will find that what they're used to singing is exactly what you're playing. That's easy. Now let's look at a hymn that goes down. In the 6 hymns in 6 days, this is written in the key of G. But in the hymn book, number 7 is written 2 steps down. Instead of a D, the first note's a C. So let's just take the transposer and do exactly that. Now when people sing, it'll be in a comfortable range. It won't be so high. Incidentally, if it's still too high, use the transposer and go down a little bit more. So you can put the hymn in what's comfortable for people to sing. And that's not a bad thing at all. Remember that taking the sacrament and singing hymns are the only two things that we all do together in sacrament meeting. It's important. Oh, one other little thing. If you're playing for a priesthood meeting, the men like to sing low. So go ahead and use the transposer to move it down a little bit. It'll make them more comfortable, and some of those guys might actually surprise you and sing. Now, there are a couple different ways you can play these things out of the 6 hymns in 6 days. If you're really timid about it, just play the melody and the note that it gives the name of the chord. Or play the chord name with the pedal. Or if the melody's too hard, just play the chord. And any melody notes you want to. Pum, 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 pum. So you don't have to put them all in. The hymns are something people are familiar with. So play enough so that they can pick it up. And if it's too hard, just skip the notes. They'll fill them in for you. Hey, let me tell you one more handy way to cheat. And that is, in the hymn book, most of the hymns are made up of 4 phrases. In 6 hymns in 6 days, each phrase covers 2 lines. So the first phrase, the second phrase, and the fourth phrase are almost exactly the same. So if you learn the first phrase and the third phrase, you have learned the whole hymn, because the others repeat. Let me give you an example. Come listen to a prophet's voice. First phrase. Second phrase, almost exactly alike. And the fourth phrase. Only the third phrase is really different, and that goes. So if you learn the first phrase and the third phrase, you've learned the whole hymn. So let's play it, and I'll show you. This one's the different one. And back to the same old thing. We want to make this as easy as possible.